right, looks like we're ready to get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our Good Governance and Budget Training webinar as part of our Common Agenda education series. This webinar will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel to be shared widely. We'll answer any and all questions at the end of each chapter section, so please feel free to put any of your questions or thoughts into the Q&A chat box below. Now, I do want to note that this is 501c3 and is intended as an education on strong conservation policy. And we do recognize that it's an election year, but for the purposes of our educational series, we are not engaging in conversations about specific or general legislation or bills. So now I'll pass it on to Lillian, our Clean Energy and Climate Justice Manager here at VCN, to take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lillian, and I'm VCN's Clean Energy and Climate Justice Policy and Campaigns Manager. And I have the honor today of introducing some of the authors of the policy papers in the Good Governance section of our 2024 Common Agenda. So our first chapter here is about utility accountability, and we will start with Laura Gonzalez Guerrero from Clean Virginia discussing shifting utilities incentives for affordable clean energy. Laura will be followed by Elisabeth Chaves with Virginia Organizing, covering ensuring access to essential services. And lastly, we have Dan Holmes from Clean Virginia, who will talk about curbing electric utilities' political influence. If you have any questions for Laura, Elisabeth, or Dan while they're presenting, please go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A box. And with that, I will pass it off to Laura to get us started.
Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you, VCN, for coordinating this webinar. I'm Laura Gonzalez, Energy Policy Manager at Clean Virginia. We collaborated in this paper with Appalachian Voices and the Climate Action Alliance for the Valley. Basically, the need for this paper was to start thinking about reshifting the incentives of our investor-owned utilities, including Dominion Energy and Appalachian Power Company, because these are the most prominent actors in Virginia's electric system. Together, they manage 80% of the electricity demand in the state. And as we transition towards 100% clean energy, it will be critical to work with these utilities and ensure that the incentives driving them align with the Commonwealth's goals of having a zero carbon energy system that is also reliable and affordable. And a significant barrier to this collaboration is that the utilities' financial incentives are not well aligned with this public interest and this state's goals. Currently, our investor-owned utilities make money by doing two things. One, building expensive capital projects, and second, selling electricity. So as a result, the utilities' profit depends on being able to justify the most expensive capital solutions and selling as much electricity as possible. Under this system, utilities are not incentivized to save energy and use least cost alternatives to transition towards clean energy. We've seen some of our utilities consistently creating barriers to customer-owned and third-party owned solar, as well as energy efficiency, because both rooftop solar and reductions in energy would cut into utilities' profits. Another conflict of interest for utilities currently is power purchase agreements, or PPAs, for solar energy. A PPA is an arrangement where the utility buys solar or wind energy from another party instead of building its own generation facility. Third-party owned PPAs have been recently reported to be cheaper than utility-owned resources. However, utilities have restricted PPAs to only 35% of their clean energy requirements, which is a problem, because it deprives Virginia customers of the least cost clean energy available. Our paper also discusses how utilities recover their fossil fuel costs. Basically, these costs are passed through directly to customers' electricity bills, meaning utilities have no skin in the game when fossil fuel prices fluctuate. And for this reason, they don't have any clear financial pressure to really transition away from those energy sources. So we think that all these reasons lead us to the need to take a very hard look at shifting utilities' financial incentives to align them with the state's public policy goals of, again, achieving the zero carbon energy system that is also reliable and affordable. We need to start thinking about reforms that compensate utilities based on performance instead of based on how expensive capital projects are. Across the country, more than 17 states have begun evaluating performance-based regulatory models, and almost every state has adopted at least one mechanism to align utilities' financial incentives with public policy goals. To give you an example, one critical piece of the puzzle is to start tracking performance in areas where we have no clue how utilities are doing, and we have no way to increase accountability. For example, some utilities are taking as little as 3 days to interconnect rooftop solar, and our utilities are taking months to do so. So we must start understanding how long is it taking for utilities to interconnect distributed resources, what is a good benchmark, a good target, and penalize or reward utilities for outstanding performance or underperforming. And so given these challenges and ideas, we have three main recommendations in our policy paper. First, the State Corporation Commission, Virginia Energy, and the General Assembly should study regulatory reforms that increase cost containment and compensate utilities based on performance rather than only the value of capital expenses. Second, we need to remove the 35% cap on power purchase agreements to allow all available, qualified, and cost-competitive PPAs to be part of Virginia's energy mix. And third, we need to study a cost-sharing mechanism that splits the risk of fossil fuel costs and price volatility between utilities and customers. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Lillian.
Thank you so much, Laura. Next up, we have Elisabeth.
Wait for the slides to get up. Thanks, Lillian. There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Elisabeth Chaves, the Climate Equity Policy Fellow at Virginia Organizing. And as you can see, I am not an author of this paper. So first, I want to thank Kendall, Joy, and Peter for their important work on this issue. And I also want to acknowledge Emily Piontek's past work on this issue. She did a lot to get us where we are. Access to energy and water utilities is essential for human health and well-being. We cannot live without them. Unfortunately, households can lose that access because they're unable to afford their utility bills. Shut-off protections can not only protect access to essential utilities, but also prevent households from going further into debt because of high reconnection fees, penalties, late fees, and required security deposits. Virginia is one of only 7 states in the country that does not have weather-related shutoff protections, and the state needs to do better. All right, next slide. So some challenges. Challenge 1. In Virginia, we have 33 electric utilities, 8 gas utilities, and more than 50 water and wastewater utilities. Some are regulated by the State Corporation Commission, others by municipalities. This disparate regulatory oversight means consumer protections vary. For example, a handful of municipal utilities do have some form of weather protections. The city of Martinsville won't shut off a household if the temperature is below 35 degrees or above 92 degrees. Dominion Energy, on the other hand, has no formal weather-related protections, and Appalachian Power may soon have them thanks to a proposed rate case settlement at the SCC. For the past 2 years, legislation has been introduced at the General Assembly to institute shutoff protections, and moving that legislation forward has had to take all of these different utilities and how they are governed into account. Challenge 2, because of structural racism, both historic redlining and ongoing undervaluation of housing in Black and brown neighborhoods, households of color on average have higher energy burdens. An article this week about Richmond highlighted the difficulties some homeowners of color have maintaining and improving their homes because they don't have the money to do so, thanks both to sharply increasing property values and the resulting tax assessments, and also not being able to access the equity in their homes. Throw in high utility bills, and there's even less money to pay for needed repairs and subsequent weatherization measures that could help to bring those bills down. Challenge 3. As utility bills continue to increase, more people may have difficulty keeping up with their payments. There are already almost 450,000 households in Virginia that are state income eligible for federal energy assistance through LIHEAP, but only 23% of those are receiving any aid. People are then forced to choose between paying for groceries, for medicine, or for their energy bills. In 2021, 33% of low-income Virginians had to make that choice. If their utilities are shut off for non-payment, then they also risk eviction. So let's talk about some solutions. Next slide, please. Obviously, Virginia needs to establish shut-off protections to protect vulnerable households, to ensure people are not losing access to utilities during extreme heat or cold weather, and to keep utilities from making shutoffs on non-business days or before weekends or holidays, so that people don't have to go without access to utilities for long periods of time. We also need more information about how, when, where, and to whom shutoffs are happening. Data and policy transparency around shutoffs will help us identify the impacts of high utility bills and shutoffs, and also help target aid to where it is most needed. All of the unregulated utilities need to offer low-income payment plans, and also ones that are feasible, which goes for all of the utilities. Data transparency will reveal if those plans are working. And lastly, low-income households, whether they rent or own, need better access to comprehensive energy efficiency and weatherization programs, because shutoff protections, while necessary, are a short-term solution. The goal is to eliminate energy burden altogether by reducing energy demand and by improving access to cheaper renewable energy. Thanks. And I think the last slide has my contact info. And I will pass it back. Thanks.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And next up, we have Dan. And again, if y'all have questions for Elisabeth, Laura, or Dan, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Holmes. I'm the Legislative Director for Clean Virginia. And oops, wrong slide. Let me get back up a step. This is our paper on curbing electric utilities' public influence, and a huge issue. And I'll go right into the challenges. We're dealing with monopoly utilities in this case. Our electric utilities operate as a monopoly. They are unlike other corporations in the sense that in exchange for a territory that is exclusively theirs, they've agreed to regulation by the state. So again, when we talk about corporate donations to campaigns, that's one thing, but this is something entirely different. These are entities that are regulated by the very people that they would be giving campaign contributions to. And I could go into the conflict of interest there, but let's just dive a little bit deeper. Again, they are expected to operate in the public interest, and therefore we are entitled to diligent regulation and oversight by those same General Assembly members that are currently accepting campaign contributions from our utilities. These utilities also are obviously focused on the committees that regulate them, primarily Commerce and Energy or Commerce and Labor committees in the House and Senate, respectively. So those members that sit on those committees, ultimately, if you take a look at the VPAP page and see where the contributions are coming in, you'll see that those legislators ultimately are receiving usually higher levels of campaign contributions. Further complicating this is lawmakers are allowed to own stock in these companies. So the decisions that they're making, if it would influence the stock price of the company, obviously we would consider that a conflict of interest, as it would potentially increase their personal wealth. So there are some things that we can do to deal with this issue. The first would be prohibiting our public utility monopolies from contributing to campaigns. And now, again, this is unlike a regular corporation, and I know everyone thinks about campaign contributions and Citizen United and how that changed the landscape of political giving, both at the state level and national level. But we have the ability to actually ban campaign contributions, and matter of fact, from utilities, and matter of fact, more than half of the states do so. As well, we think it's wise to ban the General Assembly members from owning stock in these utilities. Again, these decisions don't just go before the committees. Ultimately, they're decided on by the entire body. So again, wanting to highlight where there's a conflict of interest. Another way that we could deal with this that's not included in the paper, it would also be strengthening our conflict of interest laws and transparency. Lastly, this is a problem that is one that surprises most Virginians when they find out. We currently have no prohibitions from the personal use of campaign funds. So if you receive money in your campaign, you could use that money to send your kid to college. You could use that money to buy a new car. You could use it to pay your rent. And currently there's no prohibition. Now, while there's some transparency there, still this is kind of an arcane law, and I only aware of one other state that allows something along those lines. So we feel like these three measures would help rein in this influence. As well, I would say, in absence of a ban, we should at the very least be looking at caps. I think everybody's taking a look at elections these days and seeing how expensive they are to get. This is obviously impacting the average person from entering these types of races. And the monopoly utility Dominion is one of the top donors of these campaigns. So it is the leading corporation and that of all campaign giving in Virginia. And with that, I'll show my contact information, and I'll turn it back over to Lillian for general questions.
Thank you, Dan. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So I think you all did an excellent job explaining your policy papers. Thank you again. If there are no questions, we're going to move on to our next chapter of the Common Agenda, which is our next two authors are going to be talking about environmental equity. So first, we have Peter Anderson from Appalachian Voices, who will discuss advancing environmental justice. And then we will have Daria Christian, who will be talking about supporting Virginia's education workforce. And again, if you have questions for either Peter or Daria, please put those in the Q&A box, and we will address them after both papers have been presented. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to you, Peter.
Great, thanks, Lillian. And I should also have some slides coming up here in just a moment. All right, thanks, Andriana, for the slides. So good afternoon, folks. Again, my name is Peter Anderson. I'm the Director of State Energy Policy for Appalachian Voices. I'm based in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I'm going to be presenting a little bit on the paper we wrote as a group, Advancing Environmental Justice. So definitely want to give a lot of credit to Josephus Almond, who's with the Southern Environmental Law Center, Jay Ford with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Grace Tucker with Environmental Defense Fund for all their work and contributions to this paper and to the policy advocacy on this issue more broadly. So we can move to the next slide. We'll jump right in. Oh, I can. Do I drive the slides, Andrea? Great. So diving into the challenges, I put the first bullet here is sort of the biggest takeaways. Look, we've made a lot of progress in Virginia in recent years on environmental justice. But the fact of the matter is low-income communities and communities of color in Virginia still bear disproportionately the burdens of industrial development and economic development, and they don't share in enough of the benefits proportionate to everyone else in our Commonwealth and in our country. So this is a big problem. We've the phrase environmental justice, which is sort of, we get into the Virginia definition on the right hand side of the slide there, which is adopted from US EPA's definition. We've been discussing these comments as a nation, or these concepts as a nation, since I think the 1980s or prior. And if folks remember, way back in the 90s, there was a presidential executive order sort of laying out this definition that we accept today. So really, we're talking about the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of everyone, regardless of your background, regardless of your wealth and power and where you live, when it comes to decisions that impact your environment and the sort of quality of life that you can have in your community. And so, I alluded to the progress that we've made in recent years. We passed the Virginia Environmental Justice Act in 2020, but one of the challenges we still face is, what does it mean for state government to implement the Virginia Environmental Justice Act? Many of our state agencies are doing nothing. Some of the key permitting agencies, like Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, have recently begun to develop draft permitting guidance of how they are going to consider justice in permitting decisions. And based on those drafts that we've reviewed, those are still lacking. We aren't considering cumulative impacts of legacy pollution added to new pollution impacts from new proposals when our agencies consider permits. So we need to do better. We also have a council that advises the governor on environmental justice, and it's supposed to be staffed with 21 appointees, citizen appointees from across the Commonwealth to represent the diverse communities across our great state. That council currently, of the 21 folks who are supposed to sit on that council in advising the governor, we only have 7 right now. So we need to staff up there and go forward with those appointments. So we'll get to the next slide here and just really quickly go through the solutions. We need to fill those vacancies on the EJ Council. We need to do further work on sort of integrating environmental justice into decision-making across all agencies, but especially at DEQ. So I mentioned the permitting guidance. That's the second bullet point there. We used to have an interagency task force to coordinate this work, but that was created in the Virginia budget. It was not a permanent task force. So we'd like to reestablish that interagency coordination on EJ issues. And then again, getting back to the sort of the bottom bullet point here is making sure that agencies actually incorporate environmental justice considerations into the actual decision that is made. So, not every project is a good project. At the end of the day, some of the pollution impacts that would disproportionately impact folks should lead to permit denials. So agencies can do better, and we're going to keep pushing them to do so. I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Peter. And next up, we have Daria.
All right, just getting my slides up and ready. I'm Daria Christian. I'm the Executive Director for Friends of the Rappahannock. I'm also the Board Chair for the Virginia Association for Environmental Education. And I'm here presenting our paper supporting Virginia's education workforce. Thank you to the Environmental Education Work Group who works on this issue, and also to the co-authors who you can see listed here. So some of the challenges that our work group identified is that teachers are reporting that they are overwhelmed, and therefore our teacher retention rates are decreasing across our school districts. And therefore school districts are relying on inexperienced and sometimes underqualified replacements for teachers. And therefore, professional development is a real necessity. In addition, teachers are filling in roles that were traditionally handled by other staff people, maybe administrators, because just everybody is feeling overwhelmed in the education field. And so a lot of the teachers are doing the environmental literacy support, planning for field experiences for environmental education, and they're not being compensated for that role. So we are proposing that we would like to make sure that our teachers are compensated not only for receiving professional development that often takes place outside of their contracted hours, but also for filling in these roles, doing the environmental literacy support work that is so important. So as far as our policy solutions, we would like to create a competitive grant program that would be managed by DCR, by the Office of Environmental Education. And we'd like to fund that program to start at $600,000. We want to require the grantees to use the money to provide stipends for professional development and support environmental literacy planning and implementation. And the goal of this is to make sure that the money is actually going towards environmental literacy support and implementation. We've done a lot of work over the years of trying to track where the money flows, how the money flows through various systems. And it's really hard to make sure that the money that maybe was earmarked for environmental education and environmental literacy support is actually doing that work. And so through this fund, we believe that this will be the mechanism that will make sure that that money is going where it was intended. And there is my contact info.
Thank you, Daria. Okay, so I have a question for Peter. Curious about who is responsible for filling vacant positions in the Virginia Council on Environmental Justice, and what are some of the barriers to getting those filled?
Oh, just looking for the mute button there. Yeah, that's a really good question. So ultimately, these are gubernatorial appointments. So the non-legislative citizen members are supposed to be appointed by the governor. That process often goes through sort of the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources, and then the Secretary of the Commonwealth, I think, ultimately makes recommendations to the governor. So I don't have a whole lot of insight as to where the hang up is and why these aren't happening. But we have seen a council that has had close to a full slate of the 21 citizen members in past years. And as some of their terms have expired, we haven't seen any new appointments. Not sure if I think that was only half the question I answered, but they are supposed to be governor's appointments.
That's helpful. Thank you. And I have a question in the chat. This looks to be related to Dan's paper from earlier, and Dan had to hop out, but possibly Laura will be able to answer this one. And if not, we can get back to this person after the meeting. So Laura, if you're still on, the question is, prohibiting public utility monopolies from donating to campaigns sounds like a great policy. However, would this contradict Citizens United and be thrown out in court? Or are there loopholes that could be leveraged? And it's possible there are other folks on this panel who might have insight here. So I'll open up the floor to any of these authors who might have a good answer here.
I don't have the right kind of a very legalistic answer for that, but I know other states do ban utilities contributions in these legislation banning utility contributions have not been challenged. So I'll assume it's okay, but I don't have the right kind of legalistic answer for that.
Thank you, Laura. And then we've got also in the chat the link to apply to the board. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Gustavo. All right, so if there are no other questions, we are going to switch gears a little bit and head into a budget training, which is designed to introduce generally the budget process in Virginia. So the Virginia budget is critical in our shared conservation efforts and can be a complicated and daunting process, but we are very lucky to have two folks with us today who are very knowledgeable about the process, and they are going to walk us through how to impact Virginia's state budget. So we have Mikaela Ruiz-Ramon from the Nature Conservancy and Nathan Thomson from James River Association here. And again, please pop those questions for them in the Q&A box as they come up. And with that, I'll pass it to you two, Mikaela and Nathan.
Great. Thank you so much, Lillian. And hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon. The budget is very important, so it's great that you're here. All right, so we've got slides coming up. All right, so let's begin with just the bare bones basics. What is the budget and why is it so important that we're spending time talking about it today? So the Virginia budget is a huge document, roughly 600 to 700 pages when all said and done, that states how Virginia is going to spend its money. So this is the general fund, which is state tax dollars. It's money that Virginia gets from the federal government for different programs and purposes. It's money that's coming in from the sale of licenses and collecting fees and fines. It's everything. So the budget for this year, just for context, fiscal year 2024, what we're in right now, was $85 billion. So this is a lot of money. This is basically state government in a nutshell. So if you're a state agency and you want to spend money on anything, staff, operations, programs, grants, it needs to be written into the budget or else it does not happen. It cannot happen. So just take a moment to honestly think about all the ways that you interact and intersect with state government in both your personal and professional capacities. You know, the funds to repair the pothole in the road on your way to work, the school, if your children go to a public school, administration and funding of grant programs for different priorities that you work on, funds to counties and cities for public safety. Again, state budget, really important. So here's a couple of key things to keep in mind as we discuss kind of the process and how this works. In Virginia, we have a biennial budget. So we pass a state budget every 2 years. We pass a new budget in even years and amend it in odd years. So there's a budget process of some kind happening every year, but the big budget is in the even years. If you remember in September, we did have some kind of budget action going on. That was the General Assembly passing amendments to the budget that was already at play, you know, on the books in action. So the budget that the General Assembly is going to be working on come January is for fiscal years 2025 and 2026. Our state fiscal year is from July 1st to June 30th. So in practical terms, this budget is going to govern every dollar that's being spent between July 1st of next year and June 30th of 2026. The Virginia budget is always a balanced budget. We, unlike the federal government, what we have is what we can spend and not a penny more, which really does create some challenges down the road because, you know, there are a lot of great programs and there's not always enough money to go around. And it really does come down to these difficult decisions about what gets funded. Our budget in Virginia is led by the executive branch. So agencies are submitting requests to the cabinet secretaries who are then sharing them with the governor, who then puts all this together into a proposed budget. And then the General Assembly is basically going in and saying, like this, don't like that, and they're making tweaks. But it's being initiated and driven starting in the executive branch. And then finally, and this one's really key, the budget is not only about funding, it's also about policy. The state budget overrules existing state law. So it often includes a lot of state policy provisions that are making tweaks to things that are on the books and saying, actually, let's do it this way. It was written this way, but we're going to do it this way now, according to the budget. And that supersedes what is already written. Okay, so now on this handy slide that you've hopefully been taking a gander at, let's talk about how the budget works. The budget, you're going to hear the most about it kind of in the media starting in December and going, you know, through the winter into the spring, because that's when the most visible work is happening on the budget process. However, is really a 12-month deal. Work on the budget never stops. It's a continuous process. As soon as one budget is passed in April, work begins on the next one. So agencies don't stop, and neither does our engagement and advocacy as people interested in what happens in the budget. That said, as you can see on this slide, there are kind of some distinct phases to how this comes about. And you'll hear this many times. You can, you know, keep a bingo card, but the earlier you get involved in the budget process, the better your chances of seeing your priorities reflected in the budget. You can see it on the screen. The best day to make your ask was yesterday. The next best day is today, and so on and so forth. It's a continuous process. So, you know, you've always got next year that you can get on the elevator, but it's really good to start early. Okay, so on to the next slide. Let's start digging in. How does this work? So over the summer is basically when agencies start putting together, you know, what do we need what do we want? They're submitting these requests in August. So the Department of Planning and Budget will issue instructions for agencies to prepare and submit these requests. They've kind of been mulling over the summer, and that goes in September. And then all of this information is online. I'm going to drop the link in the chat in just a sec. But you can go to this website. The link is also on the screen. You go to agency submissions. You can see basically what agencies are asking for. And also, if you click on the individual things, it'll tell you why, because they have to give a justification. So that's some really interesting and helpful information. You can also export all this as a Excel file and sort it and highlight things and do whatever helps you to kind of get a sense of what is happening around your priorities and what agencies are asking for. So the summer is a really good time to talk with agency leadership and agency partners and essentially get in on the ground floor of the budget process as one of these agency submissions, these agency requests for what they want money for. That's that link. Next slide, please. So these requests all get gathered together. They go to the cabinet secretaries, who then take a look and they might suggest modifications, or they'll approve or deny these requests. And then these go to the governor, who works with the Secretary of Finance and still the Department of Planning and Budget to determine which of these approved requests are going to go into the governor's introduced budget. In a perfect world, this is where you want to be, the governor's introduced budget, because if your priorities are in the governor's budget, it really dramatically increases the likelihood that, that funding, those provisions are going to stay in the budget as it goes through the legislative process. If something is in the budget, the General Assembly has to vote to remove it. So there's a lot, inertia is working in your favor if you can get your priorities into the governor's budget. Also, another benefit, if the governor wants new spending, they will put it into the proposed budget and they will do the balancing of the budget. They will figure out where the money comes from. So you don't have to figure out, okay, this is a great thing that we really want. How do we pay for it? They do that hard maneuvering. It gets a lot more challenging if you're trying to advance your priorities through budget amendments and legislative requests, because often the money committees will ask legislators, okay, sounds good. Where should the money come from? And that can be a very high hurdle to clear, and kind of create some situations you don't want to be in, where there are a lot of great priorities, and how do you pick a loser among so many winners? Also, as a note, most of the agency requests, most of the things in the budget are coming from agency requests that are available online. But there are usually some surprises that just come from the governor's office. So while the Department of Planning and Budget will capture most things, it will not capture everything. So just always be on the lookout for surprises. Next slide, please. So that's kind of where we are at this moment, putting together the governor's budget. And then it will be presented to the Joint Money Committee. This year, I believe it's going to be on December 20th. And it will be made available online on this fantastic website for everyone to basically come through, and you can see what made it in, what didn't, what's being proposed. Are there any surprises this year? This is basically the working version of the budget that is going to be taken up for consideration by the General Assembly when they convene in January. So this is a really great website. I would recommend poking around so you can see how things are organized. If you know the budget code of the item that you're particularly interested in, it can make your life a lot easier to find it quickly. Also, there are PDFs. Control F is your best friend. Next slide, please. So then we are in the new year. The first week of January, there are regional public hearings across the Commonwealth to provide citizens and advocates an opportunity to talk about their priorities. You speak, directly with some of the key members of these money committees that are making these decisions about, what's in the budget that you like, that you don't like. There are things that you didn't see in the budget that you really want to because you think they're important, and you explain why. So this is a really key time to get your piece in and say, this is what I think the budget should look like, and here's why. And then session begins, usually the second week of January. Session this year, I believe, is going to start on January 9th. And it's crazy. It's important to keep in mind that legislators have a lot on their plate at this time. Committee memberships, inter-party relationships, inter-chamber dynamics. They're trying to finish up legislation to get that submitted so it's, ready for consideration. And also we have an election, as was mentioned, so a whole bunch of new faces are just going to be trying to figure out, where are the bathrooms? Like, what floor do I need to be on? So again, you really want to have your education and talking about what your issues are and your priorities, why it matters, and what you want early, like starting now, starting yesterday. Because if you're trying to get your foot in the door, early January, you might not even be able to connect with a legislator. And if you do, you're going to be one of like 200 other things on their mind. And that's not really the receptive audience that you want. So also happening in the first week of session, members are finishing up their budget amendments to the governor's proposed budget. And these are being submitted to the appropriations and finance committees. And members will have an opportunity to testify before the committee on the importance of a given budget amendment. So that's also an opportunity to kind of get your piece in. Basically, if things didn't show up in the governor's budget, you can work between then and now, and January, with members to kind of say, can we put together a budget amendment for this? So just to recap, and then I'll pass it over to Nathan for the next chunk of the budget process. Start talking yesterday. Summer, fantastic time to be talking. Maybe get your priority included as an agency budget request. Fall, so this moment that we're in right now, still good, but things are starting to heat up. Deliberations are happening right now for what's going to be included in the governor's budget. So, talking to agency leadership, talking to the governor's office about what should be in there. What do we want to see? And also even, starting to talk with members that are in office, and also once they're elected, of, what are the issues, doing that education. We might want to see a budget amendment for X if it isn't in the governor's budget, to kind of do that groundwork so that when things start moving at the speed of light, you are ready and you have your allies with you and everyone is on the same page and you know what you're saying. And then, so December, governor's budget comes out, January, session starts. It's crazy, and Nathan's going to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Mikaela. There's a few points there that I really want to emphasize about the budget process. One in particular is that while the process has a fairly linear timeline, it can be often murky, and sometimes you'll even talk to legislators after the budget is finished and conferees have gotten together and made decisions. And you may ask, why was something left in or something left out? And sometimes they don't even have all of the answers. So a lot of this budget process is as much art as science. And it takes, the really important thing, I think, is that it takes personal relationships. It takes face time between concerned citizens, between lobbyists, and with staff and with legislators in order to put a face to an issue. That's really the most important thing that I can emphasize in the budget process is putting a face to an issue and showing that it's not just important for an organization or for nonprofits, it's important for people in the community. But returning to the kind of linear nature of things, following January and into February, that's when committee reports will go out. And so the budget begins with subcommittees of the appropriations committees or the money committees. Recently in the Senate, the appropriations and finance committee was majority Democrat, and in the House it was majority Republican. As we all know, coming up in a few weeks are the elections in Virginia, where all 140 seats
will be up for grabs. So if you know somebody who knows exactly what's going to happen in the election, I would love to talk to them. But suffice to say that the power structures that have been in place in the past may not necessarily remain, and we could see shifting party dynamics coming into this latest session, which will, of course, impact priorities within different budgets. When you're talking to legislators from various committees, it's incredibly important to be as specific as possible. We're talking about thousands of budget items, hundreds of pages in each of these budgets. So it's important to come armed with all the necessary information, including the correct numbers, especially if your budget item has a House and a Senate version, which is preferable. Those are going to have different reference numbers. And one other important point here, this final bullet, is only speak to House members about House amendments and Senate members about Senate amendments. And that is applicable to this early part of the session in February. House members are going to be laser focused on what's going on in their side of the hall, Senate in the same way. Now, there will be crossover during session, of course, but at the beginning, House members care about House things, Senate members care about Senate things. So in order to be really successful in budget asks, it's imperative to find legislators in both the chambers. That being said, if you have an issue of importance and you've found a champion who's willing to carry a budget amendment on your behalf, one piece of advice I would have is to say, who would you like to work with on this? Who would you like to see carry this in another chamber? Not all of the onus necessarily has to be on the advocates in order to do every piece of legwork. Rather, a lot of legislators have individuals, be it in their same party or perhaps different parties, who they enjoy working with. And in Virginia, we have a pretty proud tradition of bipartisanship, which makes us fairly unique in state legislatures nationwide. So it can be beneficial to work with your champion in order to find another legislator to carry an amendment, and that can exponentially increase the chance of success. Next slide, please. So coming into the February to March timeframe, committee reports will be sent to the floor of their respective chamber for a full vote by the body. I think I glossed over a little bit in the previous slide that it's very important when thinking about the budget and when thinking about amendments in the budget to be working with legislators who are on the finance committees. Generally, the Senate Finance Committee is about 15 or so legislators, and the House is about 22, 23 legislators, depending. And so while it's can be very nice to work with a legislator from your own district, one that you're a constituent of, kind of due to how the body is set up, you're much more likely to find success by working with legislators who are on the committees and perhaps who have served in leadership roles in the past. If you can work with a chair or vice chair, that's preferable, but not always possible. So members can offer amendments on the floor where advocates have little ability to impact the vote outcomes. That's not necessarily the most preferable way to get into the budget, but it is one possible way. And this is where we kind of move into the Virginia sort of fun traditionalism, where once each chamber passes its own amendment budget, out of tradition, the bills will be rejected on hand by the other chamber, Senate saying it knows best, and they reject the House's version, House doing the same. And then this is where, and you may have heard the term conferees before, each chamber appoints roughly a half dozen conferees that go into negotiations in order to resolve the differences in each budget. And this can be a really important and sometimes frustrating step in the process because it's not as transparent as the rest of the budget timeline. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when budget negotiations inevitably happen, one thing that can really be difficult from an outside perspective is trying to understand what's going on. And these are the negotiations that are happening, not necessarily in formal meetings or by email or in ways like that. These might just be sit-down meetings or conversations between staff from different conferees offices where these are unrecorded negotiations about different items in each budget. And that's why it's very important to have budget items, duplicate budget items in both the House and the Senate side. If your item is in both versions, it's much more difficult to explain it away in a negotiation, as both sides have already said, yes, this is important to us. If your item is only in one version or the other, then it's really up to how much your legislator, your champion cares. They may have 10 items in the budget and, nobody wants to say that they have favored children necessarily, but due to limited budget capacity and as Mikaela pointed out, our state running a balanced budget, there is a need to make hard choices sometimes. And while each budget item is very important, and especially those of us in the conservation community know that they all contribute to a cleaner, more prosperous Virginia, sometimes budget items can be left behind, especially if they are not being as strongly advocated for in private as they may be in public. Next slide, please. So during that negotiation timeframe, it's important to continue working with the staffers and the legislators that you've been developing those relationships with over the past few months leading up to session. So as Mikaela pointed out, when's the best time to put in budget items? When's the best time to plant a tree? Well, it was yesterday, but today is the next best option. So we don't want to. It's difficult to get what you want out of the budget if you just start asking for it in January. It's a lot of what happens in the legislature comes down to personal relationships and how policymakers and staffers want to work with each other. And so in order to do the best that we can, it's important for us to develop those relationships ourselves so that our legislators and champions are willing to put our budget items at the forefront of their efforts. After the conference report is adopted, the governor has a fixed amount of time to review the budget. Generally, that's about a 4-week time frame. And then there will be a veto session where things that, the governor has a fixed amount of time to review the budget, around 4 weeks. Amendments will be made available on LIS in advance. They often involve policy issues discussed during session. And then the amendments will be taken up during the General Assembly's veto session on the 6th Wednesday after adjournment of the regular session. Next slide, please. So the hard work's been done. The budget request was funded. It's all candy and rainbows. Well, there's still a little bit of work to be done because the agencies that these funding requests go to aren't necessarily going to be experts in the exact policy area that your organization or you are personally. And so it's imperative to begin working between the time of the amendments making it into the budget and July 1, when budget items go into effect, to begin working, reaching out and working with agencies in order to kind of shape how the language or funding is going to be executed on the ground. Funding without direction is fairly useless and can often not lead to the results that are envisioned in the first place. On July 1st, the budget goes into effect and agencies get to work on fulfilling their responsibilities, no matter whether or not they've received input. So just like it's imperative to have relationships with legislators, it's imperative to likewise reach out to individuals within agencies who are often very enthusiastic and passionate individuals who work for the state government because they believe in public service and would like to see the Commonwealth continue in a positive direction. So I find working with agencies, they're often amenable to suggestions as long as everything's done respectfully, and it provides a good opportunity to further that network and that connection between the conservation community and the government at large. Next slide, please. So in recap, what should you be doing? Well, at this point in time, we're coming up on the November elections, which, as I alluded to earlier, can really shake up our appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. And so individuals that may have served on them in the past may not be serving on them in the future. So what's important is to try to get out there, attend meetings, reach out to legislators and candidates and express, communicate concerns, express enthusiasm regarding certain issues. But there is still time to work with the governor's office. Obviously, the governor's not up for election this year. There's still time to work with the governor's office as they put forward their own budget priorities prior to December. So I think I've mentioned relationship building or personal relationships a number of times here, but a lot of it really comes down to that. It comes down to having data to back up budget requests and putting together a network of concerned advocates who are willing to reach out and put personal faces to issues. And I think that's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much, Mikaela and Nathan. A question for both of you is, how do local budgets intersect with the state budget process? And related to that, how does federal funding play into the state budget process?
I can say that I'm not necessarily an expert in that area. We have someone on here who may be able to address that a little better than me. Nikki, are you available to take that one?
Sure. Hi everyone, it's Nikki Rovner with TNC. Mikaela and Nathan, you've done a fabulous job. Thank you. Local budgets are every local government is getting money from state government for something, for the schools, for many other public services that flows through the state. So they get very antsy when the state takes longer to pass a budget than is planned. The calendar that Mikaela and Nathan just went through is the ideal calendar that is usually followed, but as we all know, this past year it was not followed and there was no state budget until September, and that made things really difficult for local governments because they had to make budget decisions based on guesses about how much money they're going to get from the state. for certain things. So that's how they interact. And then most of the federal money that comes to the state, it still has to go through the state budget. And so there has to be some sort of permission or authorization for state agencies to spend that federal money. And so that's the main relationship between federal funding and state funding. I hope that answers the question, or at least partially.
Yes, thank you, Nikki. And another question is, what happens to the bills that get passed but remain unfunded in the budget?
In effect, and this is maybe not the most pleasant outcome, but in effect, unfunded bills are kind of dead on arrival. They remain on the books, and they are, law, so to speak, but they can't really go into effect until there's they're compelled to fund the program. And so it's really important. It's tantamount to have a funding mechanism in place when looking at legislation. And I think I can say pretty confidently that most legislators that you talk to, if you bring forward language that you'd like to see, they're going to ask, what is the funding mechanism? Now, it's true that Virginia is facing a surplus in the upcoming budget. And so in a number of meetings I've been in recently, people said, well, we've got a surplus coming up, so we should ask for our slice of the pie, so to speak. Well, everybody is thinking that way, and everybody's going to be putting in their ask for the additional monies that are available. So just because there appears to be a lot of money available, it's kind of like a highway. As far as you expand it, that's as much traffic is going to show up. No matter how wide we make 95, it's always going to fill itself up.
Thank you, Nathan. That's a helpful analogy. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I just want to thank you again, Nathan and Mikaela, and also all of our authors for presenting and for the work that you all are doing every day. And I'm going to pass it to Adriana to close us out.
Thank you so much for that, Lillian. So thanks so much for everyone who's here and is willing to hear my little blurb. So we have just launched General Assembly Preview. This morning, a newsletter email went out. And if you didn't get it, that's no problem. I'll put that in the chat if you'd like to register. Yeah, the registration link is now in the chat. So General Assembly Preview, essentially we have regional watch parties throughout the state so that you can prepare with local advocates and other conservationists for a General Assembly that's upcoming in the spring. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick. And you can see we have locations. Oh, maybe it's still loading. Okay, there you go. We have locations in Charlottesville, Fredericksburg, Hampton, Harrisonburg, Lexington, Northern Virginia, Prince William County, Richmond, Roanoke, Virginia Beach, and Warrenton. We have increased our locations from last year because of how successful this event is. So if you have any other questions, essentially we'll hear from policy experts in our network that will help with specific legislations and bills. So our education series this month is different because we're just learning about the issue areas in our common agenda, but then once General Assembly Preview comes around, we learn about the specific bills and legislation. So definitely recommend registering for that. We also have an online option for people who can't join in person, and the online option is free, so you don't have to feel like you're missing out. Right? Also want to mention, if you want ways to get involved with advocacy, the first step you can always take is by looking up who your legislators are and contacting them about issues that are important to you. And you can do that through the virginiageneralassembly.gov site. You can also share the recording from our YouTube channel. This recording, along with the past ones, you can see in the screenshot here that we post all of our past sessions up as well. You can also check out our Take Action page to see upcoming events that we are hosting along with in our network. And we also have guides like our General Assembly Advocacy Guide that will be updated in real time. That will be definitely a useful resource to bookmark once the General Assembly session starts. And there's also other guides like Media for Advocacy and a virtual civic engagement guide. So lots of helpful resources here. And then I also want to highlight that our last webinar in the Our Common Agenda educational series will be on land use and transportation, and that will be next Thursday on November 2nd. So hope to see you there. All right, with that, we're ready to close, and I hope everyone here has a wonderful rest of your week.